Okay, well, I think it's clear what we should do. This is a general discussion, and as such, I think it would be very stilted to require every contributor to go through the chair. My job is to steer it, but what I will do is if people go off the point, I'll say something, but I won't exactly say talk amongst yourselves, but don't always go through the chair. Right? And I think it's fairly obvious what we've got to start with. Session 2, intercommunal issues, had no discussion at all. So I think we should start with that. Perhaps I can use, or I might think abuse, my position as chair to ask the first question. Tabitha, I thought your paper was absolutely fascinating, and I know one or two other people did. Very, very interesting. It's just that the British regarded the Greek Cypriots as betwixt and betweens, as you so deliciously put it, or quoted it. I still don't quite see how that would transmit itself to a Greek Cypriot inability to identify themselves as Cypriots. Could you talk through that?
Not so much an inability to identify themselves as Cypriots, but a lack of confidence in who they are. I suppose, to put it bluntly.
So they would realise that the British saw them like this.
Yeah, that's essentially my contention. I think that has led to a crippling lack of confidence in indigenous Cypriotness, which you can see today in all sorts of ways. The Zaha Hadid project is just one of them. Sorry, the Zaha Hadid project is just one of them. There are numerous other examples. A reluctance on the part of Cypriots of a certain age, for instance, who have the means to go overseas for medical treatment, to have their medical treatment in Cyprus. This is something I've got first-hand experience of. My husband had to have an operation, major but fairly routine operation. I sought advice from the wife of a fairly eminent politician who I knew had had a similar operation, and she said, "Oh my dear, but when it's to do with medical matters, you can't be too safe, we always go to London." There are brilliant, brilliant surgeons in Cyprus, for God's sake. Also things like the Pharos Trust. I don't know if anybody knows that. The great and the good attend concerts organised by the Pharos Trust in great numbers. That's a thoroughly excellent organisation and deserves to be promoted. Cyprus State Orchestra is an equally excellent organisation that also deserves to be promoted. Because it has indigenous Cypriot musicians, it's not such a popular gig. Pharos Trust relies on overseas contributions. There are numerous examples like that I can and I think if you were looking for a sort of empirical line of cause and effect, it would be sort of, it's not something I can say it goes this way, and this way, but if you look at some of the examples of the sense among the British that Greek Cypriots were somehow pale imitations of themselves, which did not extend to Turkish Cypriots, who were, as I was saying earlier, exoticized and orientalized, and therefore somehow safer and not so threatening. Whereas Greek Cypriots, the writer that I was talking about, Gladys Peto, who wrote this book in 1927, talks a great deal about just the lack of good taste amongst Greek Cypriots. That's somehow not exotic and oriental and manageable because it's out there. Neither is it proper in the sense of what would... the very narrow British definitions of what constitutes proper good taste. There was a sense that there was this sort of rather vulgar imitation going on. And I can't help feeling that has fatally undermined people's sense of who they are. And I mean, it's nice.
Yes?
It's compounded by the fact there was no indigenous aristocracy. That's the other thing. There's no indigenous aristocracy that can give Greek Cypriot society confidence that, hey, we've got these people who have inherited rank and title, which was the preferred British way of governing, and was a way in which colonised people gained some kind of traction in colonised societies.
Thank you.
If you agree, Chair, I have a question to not everyone, but most of the people to
Well,
earlier on.
is this on this? What, do you have an answer?
I have one question for David as well.
All right. And
Yes.
that's good.
The impression I got from your contribution was the unsuitability of the British officials going to Cyprus, or the unsuitability of the subjects, perhaps.
Sorry, may I ask
Greek
you to
Cypriots.
speak louder because we can't hear over
My question is, did this difficulty or this phenomenon or whatever, this feature, continue until the end of the British administration 1959? Because the book was published in 1927. You have parallels, of course. And do you, even today, can you see a similarity between a section of the Turkish community, similarity with the Greeks? Later on I go to the questions of the others. For now.
It'd be useful if we continue on the same vein.
Yes, that's okay.
Sorry, come again. Could I just clarify? Do I see similarities between
The suitability of the British officials.
Yes.
Did it continue until the end of the British administration, that is in the 1960s?
I don't
Or
think
was it a feature?
No, I don't think it did. I think the big difference came at the time of the Colonial Development Act. The Colonial Development
Yes.
Act after the Second World War, where suddenly money was available for all sorts of projects which it had not been available for before. And you also see, certainly in terms of the officials who were appointed to run the forestry and the agriculture departments, an improvement in the calibre of the guys who get posted. I don't think it continued until that point, no. And there are also individuals, there were amazing exceptions. There were particularly good governors who were in post at the time of the First and the Second World Wars. I haven't done enough research to know whether that was sheer fluke and good luck or whether that was an ability on the part of the Colonial Office to pull rabbits out of hats when the situation demanded. So there were at least two senior exceptions to this. And then stuff did start to change after the Colonial Development Act. And you see a much higher calibre of officials, certainly in those two key areas.
By the way, Mr. Chair, the British were so effective vis-à-vis Cyprus in those fields, agriculture, forestry especially, land registry. Cyprus is an example all over the world, which proves exactly the opposite of what you are saying. But that's, of course,
I'm not saying necessarily that the departments were not. Well, I think the success of the forestry department in particular was. I mean, there was a particular issue with the forestry department. They had some horrendous people there in the 20s and 30s who, whilst they implemented policies that were very, very good in terms of conserving the forestry, they were bloody harsh in terms of the implications that they had for the peasantry and were directly responsible for these huge arson attacks. Much of the Paphos forest was burnt and completely destroyed because of that. So I'm not sure this is necessarily an appropriate level of detail to go into at this forum, but I think you could argue that although the policy that was pursued was extremely efficient, almost to the point of ruthlessness, it was not necessarily put into practice as sensitively or as thoughtfully as it could have been by more capable officials. Does that make sense? Do you see what I'm saying? If you had a better guy who was in charge of forestry in the 20s and 30s. He could have done the same good work, but in a much less offensive way, I think.
I would hate to disagree with you, but I do. I'm disagreeing with you as someone who's British, and that's not how I see the Cypriots or the Greek Cypriots, if you want to differentiate them. There's also contradictions with the analysis, because on the one hand it is said, I mean, I would be interested to see the research, so maybe I'm wrong. You have on the one hand someone as prominent, away from the church, someone as prominent as Churchill making a profound statement in 1947, I think 46 or 47, saying that the Hellenism of the Greek Cypriots is so profound. Yes, it might have been Hellenic. And he offered Cyprus to Greece, and we had this discussion before. Greece wasn't able to take it, whatever. So I don't see that weakness, but I do accept and understand that maybe the perception from Britain at the time. I see a confident people, very confident people, and in some respects I also disagree, and I see confident people who are actually slightly arrogant, rather than the reverse. My experience when I'm over there is there isn't any lack of confidence, and if anything else, they're overconfident. They need to calm down a bit. So that's where it goes wrong. It's in my brain on a practical basis. That's not what I have seen or witnessed. That's not how my family behave. That's not how people are. And sorry that I'm saying it, but I don't see.
Can I reply to that? And I'm being asked to remind people to speak up.
Okay, again, this is purely a personal perception. It seems to me it's the confidence of the slightly insecure adolescent, so it's not quite certain who it is, so it's got to speak a little bit louder and be a little bit more pushy and assertive, and actually if it had a more congruent sense of feet on the ground, it could quieten down a bit. So I would not disagree with some of your observations. Just to me, as an outsider, and that has to be the perspective from which I'm looking at this, it seems slightly different.
Okay, yes, it's on what Tabitha has said. Last year, about this time of the year, we were taken by a British organisation to Scotland, Edinburgh and Glasgow, to show us the best monuments architecturally and otherwise of Edinburgh and Glasgow. In Glasgow, after having seen the art school and Mackintosh and people like that offer the place such glory, they said, we are going to show you something very important. The next new transport museum of Glasgow will be built by Zaha Hadid. They were so proud, and I believe the Scots are so nationalistic and so proud of that, legacy in the arts and everything, that they wanted to show us, together with everything they have, what they're visualizing for the future. After a few months, I got this magnificent invitation from Rome, saying they are going to inaugurate a museum in the heart of Rome by Zaha Hadid. In Germany, there is a big thing that is already done, and it is by Zaha Hadid. I don't know which country doesn't have a Zaha Hadid. What I mean is that I think the Cypriots are fearless, and that they are arrogant, as Ioannides said, because they think they can really very easily go with the rest of the world. We had modernism like Le Corbusier in Cyprus. We had Gropius in Cyprus. We are people who really didn't stick to our traditions very much. Otherwise, we would still be building ancient temples in the ancient Greek style. This is my first point. The second point is the profile of Cyprus. It is very important to understand the profile of the Cypriot. The first idea we had, the self-image we had as Cypriots, was crafted, published, circulated by the British when they came to Cyprus. Before then, before 1878, the Ottoman Empire did not really allow for any kind of identity. People were crushed, whether they were Greeks or Turkish Cypriots. That's why Jubrez will tell you perhaps that there were 3 uprisings which were common by Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots against the Ottoman rule, which was very heavily suppressing them. Okay. 1878, we have print in Cyprus, print. It is exactly the same time with the Ottoman, with the British coming to Cyprus. What happened then? We get and I was reading this book only a few days ago. I get all the impressions of the people who arrived from Britain there to cover the new colony. And it is so diminishing about Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots. They say they are not 3, lazy. They are of poor taste. They are illiterate. They don't know how to eat. They treat their women badly. Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots alike. I mean, I couldn't believe, I couldn't identify at all. I couldn't believe that my ancestors were such animals. But our first self-image was crafted by colonialism, British colonialism. And this went on. 10 years after the British went to Cyprus, 10 years after, there are people who go, again, I can give you the names because I have the book. 10 years they say the fiasco, or what we did in Cyprus is a fiasco. The British said that. Because they said we were to develop this place. 10 years after, we have done nothing. The Cypriots are still hungry, there is no education, and I think really we made a mess of things. These are the first impressions. Now, with the print in Cyprus, we have the new ideas coming to Cyprus. We have nationalism, indeed, coming from Greece, and we have the socialist ideas at the same time. So the Cypriots are really identifying with what is happening in Europe, with the new states of Europe, i.e. that colonies are out of fashion and that we should have an identity, and it was either very Greek and very nationalistic, or it was very left-wing. And we have these 2 movements which really identify Cyprus, and for which there are still people who have, who propose these 2 as solutions, or sometimes they try to mix the 2. Now, the third thing is that Cyprus' identity has been menaced by what happened in 1963 and in 1974 with the intercommunal difficulties and attacks, and also with the junta coup. This had shaken Cyprus. I mean, many people who were with the Okavita said, my God, what did we fight for? This is not an oasis, because Cyprus was invaded. So yes, there was a shake in the identity of Cypriots. But I believe from studying and from my experiences in Cyprus and in Britain, that Cypriots do not have the dilemma whether they are Greeks, if they are Greeks, or Cypriots, or the Turks, the Turkish Cypriots. I don't think they have this dilemma. Greek Cypriots know they're Greek, finished. They don't waver. They don't say, no, I'm just Cypriot. It's like the Cretans. The Cretans say, I'm Cretan, but they mean the Greek Cretans. The Cypriots, when they say, I'm Cypriot, they don't have to say, I'm Greek, I was born there, my father was Greek, and no. And I was raised by a family of trade unionists, and we never had to question if the person next to us, who was in the workforce, was Turkish Cypriot or Greek Cypriot. We didn't have any problem with the Turkish Cypriots. Now, my last point is this, that the 2 communities separated not because they chose to, and all research shows here in England that the best way of people to get on is to be together, to work together. Why didn't we have any strife in London? Because they worked together in the trade unions, in the same factories, having the same problems, sharing commonalities, sharing everyday life. So I believe that, no, our self-image was crafted from the beginning in a very negative, condescending and imperialistic way, colonialist way. And we had to get out of that and craft for ourselves our identity. And I don't think nowadays it is because of a kind of complex that we have Zaha Hadid. It's because we are very proud and because we are very confident that Zaha Hadid is not going to change our profile at all. Thank you.
You want to have an opportunity at the end? Some people have some comments.
No, I'm scared. I couldn't begin. I'm
Okay.
sorry to go on about Zaha Hadid, but I do think that is a singularly inappropriate monument.
Yes.
And I can't understand why indigenous Cypriot architect firms were just ruled out of the contest.
We have one
early
there.
on.
He's a Cypriot architect in Zaha Hadid. He's there.
I'm sorry, I find it really offensive. I think it's a continuation of colonialism, that this woman who's never been to the island is designing this monstrosity, and everybody thinks it's great. But anyway, that's
Iraq never colonized Cyprus. Iraq was never
If I
colonized.
may just add to that, and I'm completely in agreement with you, and we voiced that to the mayor, but I'm not sure how much of it sank in the other day. But I think what's happened with this designer, the architect, it's the same as the publicity of actors and actresses in America. When you publicize somebody enough, everybody wants them. It doesn't make them any better. It's just that they've been publicized enough for somebody to say, I am good enough to have that person. I believe that that's all it is.
We need Prince Charles on the case.
But I mean, support of the project, 100%. And I think in Cyprus, we do have, I said that in the morning, we have a huge number of graduates, a huge number of professionals. We have no problem in finding one. But yet, the external aspect of the project, it does relate to the image you give outside. I have been in every European city, and in every European city, the major modern building is not built by a local. Go to Bilbao. Bilbao was an important city, it has beautiful architecture of its own, but it came on the map when they had the Guggenheim. You know, why should you get an American-Canadian architect to do it and not use a local one? I don't know. But it's a way of promoting it. And why not have somebody from outside?
But that's being done at the expense of what's there already. If
No, I don't
somebody
believe so.
brings a
I don't believe so. I mean, to my
It's
taste,
exactly
to
that.
my
That's
taste,
another issue.
to my taste, and I did send to the senior architect of that group the other day, without knowing him, I have admired that project because I played on those walls of the city, I climbed them, I fell from them, and the way it has been done, it gives me a feeling of bringing them out, not diminishing them. So that was the first one. I'll divert to another one, because actually this English-Cypriot relationship is also something I have lived. And I'm bringing it to the forestry issue. Yes, the British there have done miracles. It is one of the three areas where they have done good work. The land registry, the forestry, they failed in education, and in the forestry they were losers. I'll cite an anecdote, which it happened in my generation. You know, I was a boy in the 40s, but I remember it. There were 4 or 5 villages in the Papus forest, and the British decided that they were shepherds and charcoal makers. And the British decided, no, this is not good for the forest, because indeed, the villagers used to burn the forest to create more land for the goats to grow. So they decided to prove to the locals and to some British people who came from Britain to check on this upheaval, because it was a serious upheaval, that goats ate pine. So they took a poor animal, and the story goes they starved it for a week, and then they fed it with pine, and of course the poor animal ate it. But it never grows on pine. I mean, of course, can climb on a lot of things, but not thumb trees. Anyhow, it proved the point, and the villagers were actually very humanly and very nicely moved to the villages, new villages, which are called, they have the Panodimata, the Katodimata, and the Nea Dimata. And the Dimata is a seaside village now near Bilbos, and the houses were really modern by the standards of what they had. So it was good. And also, you know, people don't know it, that the forest north of Flatteres, when the British came, it was not a forest. It was not a forest. Because there is a very big village which, as agriculture goes with the fashion. There was a need for zivania, for export. So they cut the forest and they planted vines. Vines require a lot of attention, and they couldn't cope because they were far away from the village. And furthermore, the mines at Amianto started. So it was easier to make cash money at the mines. Very hard work. Yes. But the cash, it was paid on the spot. You didn't have to wait for a year to grow your grapes, to make your zivania, to sell it. So they moved to the mines. They neglected the vineyards. The forest returned. But the forest north of Plata, that magnificent forest that we know now, it was actually replanted by the British with the help of the Cypriots. Cypriots became very conscious of, and you know, they are not completely conscious, but they became very conscious about the forest. So, you know, it was a love-hate relationship.
Can I just pick up on some of those points and some of the things that were said earlier? The construction of Nea Dimnata and the more humane policy that you're referring to was implemented by two forestry officials, Chapman and Waterer, and they were both trained at forestry school in the UK, and they were partly funded as a result of money coming from the Colonial Development Fund. So this answers also your point earlier. Actually, there was a point where very capable, humane and intelligent officials were appointed, and that's when you start to see quite a change in British policy. The guy before them, Unwin, was a complete nutcase. he was very passionate about forests, but my God, he was a completely terrifying man. He was terrifying at home, never mind at work. His children he was one of those chaps who served up the same dinner day after day until his kids cleared their plate. He was a very scary bloke. During Unwin's term in office, when he was head of the forestry department, there were something like 500 prosecutions against villagers for unlawfully grazing their goats in forest land. Over the same period of time, if you look at, I think it was the Indian province of Uttar Pradesh, which was a much, much bigger area, there was one prosecution. So Unwin was completely ruthless, and his policy resulted directly in the burning of the Passos forest. There's no doubt about it. These guys were desperate. They were landless peasants because of the economic turbulence of the 20s and 30s. This was all they had to live on. It was really, you know, the goats stood between them and starvation. If they were prevented from grazing their goats in the forest, they would have literally starved. So it's no wonder that people persisted in doing this. It was only after the colonial development money became available, and you could get brighter people, basically, to do the work, that they were able to introduce a more moderate, less fascistic policy, I suppose.
Well, anyway, we won't be too long on the history, but I mean, you know, CD&W, Colonial Development Welfare money, was tiny, wasn't it? It went tiny amounts of money.
Yeah, but they put in bids for
If
it.
we're talking about the whole period of the British, 1878 to 1960, if you say the British did that, the British did the other thing, of course it wasn't with British money, it was with Cyprus money. We're just talking about the administration. The basic fact is, across the war period, the British didn't spend money in Cyprus. They didn't do anything in Cyprus. So this is where your Gladys Peto, who in herself is totally, of course, inconsequential, but a Malta-Cyprus comparison is interesting. I mean, 1/3 of Maltese workers are directly dependent on British money. in British employment, 1/3 of the entire workforce. In Cyprus, what would the figure be? It would be pathetic, wouldn't it? If the British had spent a lot of money, if they had built a real base in Cyprus, a big dockyard, like they did in Malta, this, as Nikki is saying, about people being brought together, working together, the cards being shuffled. Yeah? People being forced to come out of all their little compartments by the sheer dynamism of money being spent. Then you would have got this Cypriotism. You would have got a greater degree of complexity. That would have happened. But basically the Cyprus that became independent in 1960 in so many ways was the Cyprus of 1878. Really? It wasn't that way. So when you get to Independence Day and you read that actually, that you have, little celebrations, but within the communities, yeah, it's not really surprising, is it? Because in between, you hadn't really got a vigorous development going on within the society. It was mildly prosperous, Cyprus, because it had relatively fertile agriculture in its own way. So it wasn't desperate, but it wasn't developed.
No,
so nothing happened.
It totally lacked that commercial class of British speculators or investors who would have gone to other colonies, who would have, as you say, jazzed things up a little bit. It would have been a less government-led society. There would have been people engaged in commerce and trade, which would have brought them into contact in a much more equal way.
So really, the British presence in Cyprus, is a very superficial one. It's very superficial, isn't it? Over that long period. It doesn't penetrate into the broad reach of Cypriot society. And therefore not much happened. And therefore compartments aren't broken down.
Yes.
So that's
You'd be waiting a long time anyway. I'm going into my description about going through the chair. It seems to be necessary.
Somebody touched education and they said that it was divided purely on ethnic languages. What they forgot to mention is that under Turkish rule there was no education, so they had to go in secret schools, in churches and so on. Under British rule, the locals were allowed to form schools and they had to pay the teachers themselves. In other words, Britain did not spend any money at all. It was down to the locals. It wasn't even organized by the British administration there. The locals themselves, they had to feed the teacher rather than pay them from day to day, and they taught that, hence the two divisions in the language. Land registry, it was, if you look at the land registry system in Cyprus, it's totally different than the one in here. They inherited the Turkish one, and the one thing that Turkey did, they are famous for their land registration, which is well more advanced than the British one. As regards the British rule, it was mentioned, they didn't spend any money, and what was worse, we the locals could see that better things existed. For instance, I came from a village up on the mountains, which was mentioned, a very windy road that was not looked after by anybody, but I could at the same time see a superb motorway linking the Gelia to Akrotiri. So I could have had better, but the British did the road just to serve themselves, not to serve me, the local. I could see that when they needed water for their episcopal base, they created a water town in my village, Perabedi. Why didn't they create water towns for the local population when they were short of water in many parts of the island? And this, of course, created a sense of revolution. Of course, this was exploited by either mainland Greeks or and from within, of course, and from mainland Turkey. And we came to this division that we have finished up today. Instead of us as Cypriots revolting against the British rule, which we originally started, and seeking independence and being able to look after our own affairs and do the things that we wanted for our land. These are the things that obviously have affected us. The other thing that you mentioned earlier, yes, it is true. I graduated here as a chemical engineer. I went to Cyprus and worked in a cosmetics company as a production manager. They imported all their machinery from abroad. A tiny little thing broke and the production line stopped. The managing director, a local Cypriot, he said, oh, we must try and get to Italy necessary sample. I said, but we can't do it locally. And he laughed at me. He says, it's impossible. So secretly, without telling him, I went to a local workman there and I said, can you produce this thing? And he said, yes. I said, how much? He said, 35 shillings. I said, okay, you do it. Where can you do it? By tomorrow it would be ready. Following day, I didn't tell him anything because I was worried. If it didn't work, I would keep quiet. He did it. I put it back on the machine. Following day, I called him into the factory and I said, can you see anything? He says, what? He said, no, they are producing hairspray. He says, oh, did the part come from Italy already? I said, no, it came from next door. You mean to say that the Cypriot could produce something like this? Yes, and of course we, the Cypriots themselves, as individuals, we think that they are better than anybody else, but not the other Cypriot. And we have a saying, Aios στο χωρκόν του εδοξάζεται. A saint is not celebrated in their own village, which evolved from within Cyprus. So there is truth in what you said. Unfortunately, it is those who have the money who think that we haven't got the facilities in Cyprus, because it's easy for them to jump on the plane and come and buy the services from the brink. But we have excellent surgeons in Cyprus. The only thing that differs is that possibly very rare operations. A surgeon in Britain would probably do 1 or 2 a week. A surgeon in Cyprus would probably do 1 in every 2 years. That's the only difference. But we do have excellent people in there. Well, British hospitals are full of Cypriots, and British universities are full of Cypriots. But they are not recognized over there as much as they should. That's all. Thank you.
Were you next, or I'm going against my prescription, but I really would prefer if you had a call. Okay.
Thank you. I'm Christos Pasas, and I'm the project director for Cyprus. I said my name is Christos Pasas, and I'm the project director for Cyprus project in Cyprus. And I would like to offer a kind of an alternative perspective on issues of cultural identity maybe today. And instead of looking at cultural identity from the lens of, or the historical lens, or the lens of historical evolution, perhaps to remove a little bit from the emotional attachment to these issues, perhaps we can look at it from an anthropological issue from a minute. And it's interesting to observe, maybe, that indigenous Cypriot identity through the ages, starting from 2,500 years BC, maybe even earlier, started by always the subjection of Cypriot indigenous peoples to foreign rule. This didn't happen only, let's say, recently from the Ottoman Empire onwards, but it's been happening since the Phoenicians. And that is because Cyprus is a small island, it has some resources that are generally considered useful, etc. But there are some interesting landmarks or highlights in this kind of 3,000-year-old history. First of all is, of course, the Phoenicians and the alphabet. Then it's the Greek colonization and Christianity through the extension of the Byzantine era. And the Ottoman times, which is a kind of, if you like, a continuation of the Byzantine governance, but under a different religious regime. And the British colonial times, which is a fairly short period of time in this history, where there was a sensation that the system of governance that was trying to be implemented on the island was coming from the outside by that time, rather than by belonging to it. perhaps because British and Cypriot identities were remotely different. But through all of these things, I think the common undercurrent is that there is a process of realizing a potential for self-determination, and that against the kind of principles of state organization. And I think as a Cypriot, our identity has always been changing. So I find reluctance in myself to admit that we have one static identity, because our identity has been changing through the ages. Of course, there is common things, but also there are things that are changing, either from external factors or maybe factors of just the pure social evolution. And this issue of self-determination and state organization is something that concerns me quite a lot, because one is an opposite force to the other almost. It's like with state organization you try to bring things together, and with self-determination the kind of puzzle breaks apart and it becomes a kind of set of elements. And I think what can unify these two worlds is a vision to the future. In other words, not only wondering what we were, where we have been and all that, but where you want to get. Ulysses in the Odyssey had a vision of wanting to go back to Penelope for 10 years. So wherever he stopped in his in-between trip, it was part of the process of realization of this aspect. What am I trying to say? I'm trying to say that I belong in a generation who were roughly 3 years old when the Turkish invasion happened. And kids at that time, from a kind of pedagogical or human evolution point of view, learn to understand what is theirs. They have their own toys, they have their own houses, they have their own money, they have their own. In other words, they begin to develop their sense of self through ownership of things. And we lost that, because the first memories we have was that of loss. For whichever reason, I'm not being critical about the politics or whatever, there is views pro and against for all of these things, but for a long time this thing tormented us. My brother, my friends, we talked about it very much, but never on a kind of serious level. And recently we had the chance to visit Famagusta and to do an architectural workshop there, and suddenly I came to the realization that we may have been in pain for what happened in 1974, but in fact I'm beginning to realize that if and I can't speak for everybody, but if I am to liberate myself from this pain, I need to look at it in a different way. I need to realize that maybe the fact that we lost this sense of home and we became effectively homeless through that time, maybe it liberated us rather than enslaved us in a particular point in history that we can never get over, And since that time, I've traveled the world. I've been in many countries and worked in many countries. I met people like Zaha Hadid, I met people like Raymond Abraham, I met a whole spectrum of people who are exceptional in their own field, in their own way. And I try to make my home where I am. It's a little bit maybe more a kind of hippie idea, but it's a kind of liberating to feel free and to feel part of the world than feeling stuck that you belong in a particular group that is a kind of closed and static, let's say, set of values. I think, having said all these things, the Cypriot identity, and I'm going to go back to what I was saying before, is changing. It's changing all the time. It's changing. It changed when the Lebanese refugees came to Cyprus, and in Limassol, for example, all the signs of the shop changed overnight from English to Arabic. They changed when the Russians came to Cyprus, and all the Arabic signs were replaced by Russian signs. But what I'm trying to say is that through that is where we learn for what the world around us is. And we are lucky enough not to go out like in the British colonial times to discover the world. We have the luxury of having the world come to us to tell us what's going on. And we learn from that. I had a Swedish girlfriend when I was 18. it was, you know, incredible. Two different worlds, for example. Okay, but I'm giving you both social examples and personal examples to tell you that, to prove rather that these worlds meet somewhere. It happened, and it happened like that. It wasn't in my control, and clearly when I was 18, I didn't have the perspective I have today. So this idea of becoming a citizen of the world, I think, or a state in the world, is interesting for Cyprus. It's interesting for Cyprus because the only way to achieve this participation to the world system, we need to figure out how to self-rule. And that was an interesting experiment, I think, with the British colonial times. It didn't go very well because fundamentally, is my opinion, the Cypriots were not ready for that kind of thing. States, to develop into a state of independence, they go through many social revolutions. And we never had the time to catch up. When we were trying to determine and self-rule about what we wanted to be, the whole rest of the world were talking about hippie love and unification and no nuclear weapons, etc. And we were going the opposite way. So I will close with one thing. I believe that this island should unify because only through this way and through the respect of the other we can develop our self-consciousness and this participation in the world.
Any comments before we move on to someone else's presentation?
So can I just say one thing about identity that we sort of wanted to leave at the beginning? I think it is quite important to allow people to self-identify themselves. I think it is something that we have fought for in educational context, for example, as an educationalist for 30 years. It's something that we try to move away from, putting people into categories and imposing our our descriptions and our terminology on other people. So that's the first thing. I think that we do need to do that. The second thing I think is, thinking about everything that everybody has said, is that basically something that we also talk about here, you obviously have noticed that I was somebody that was brought up in England, but I am of Greek Cypriot origin. My parents came to England in 1958. But something that we wanted to obviously maintain within that was our Greek Cypriot identity in a place. If being brought up in England in the in the 50s and 60s was very much a place of denying that you were of Greek Cypriot origin and denying your roots, and really what was being imposed on you was you had to be English to be accepted. I just want to make a link to colonialism from just for a moment from that, and actually the way that Cypriots have been described by some people is something that was actually imposed on them by the colonial period, by the imperial period, and it's also something that was imposed on all peoples of the world, even though Cypriots might be slightly different. And I think we have to talk about multiple identities as well. That I myself see myself as having multiple identities, and being in Greek Cypriot in Britain, obviously there's Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots in Cyprus, but that doesn't mean that we're not all Cypriots. So I think that we have to recognise that and not fall into the same traps in a way that that as a person being brought up in England, we fell in. And I think that one of the other things that I think is quite important that we need to do is that there is quite a lot of work that has been done in terms of the achievements of Cypriots from both within Cyprus but really all over the world. And there's lots of evidence of that in numerous publications. I don't want to go through all of them, but there's a Who's Who publication, for example, the second publication this year by Yagoumi. What's his surname? Or was that his surname? Michael Yagoumi. And that is evidence of what Cypriots, Greek Cypriots are, I agree, and I think that he is looking at a third edition where he's going to also include Turkish Cypriots. I don't know if I'm right or wrong in that, but I think that he is working on that at the moment. So I think that that is evidence of what we've done, achievements of people of Cypriot origin, both in Cyprus, in Britain, all over the world, okay, since independence. So I think that we mustn't forget those achievements and not feel that we haven't achieved a lot. But I also think just quickly, in terms of the challenges, but I think that also in terms of the challenges, that we do need to look at this new group of people, that we do need to put Cypriotness into historical context, and also that changes happen, and that also there are generational changes that we obviously don't always recognise and include in our studies. Can I just say one more thing and then I'll stop? And I think that what we often lack, this is wonderful, and I always come to them and I always get a lot out of them. I often learn more from sort of my students and also being in these kind of conferences than from reading. But I think that one thing that we still lack is that there's no coordination. I've been to lots of conferences and I've been to seminars as well, also by the Cyprus Centre. I went to a very interesting one, I think, in the winter, that actually looked at education, looked at what was happening in education both in Cyprus and in both in the north and the south. Okay, and it looked at a criticism of the education systems, of the content, of the materials. It wasn't only the Cyprus seminar, it was another seminar that I'd gone to. So there's a lot actually that is going on, but we need some, I know people say they don't want any organisations, but we need the existing organisations to actually coordinate what is going on in terms of the research, because then we can use and share that.
Can I just raise what?
Sorry about that, I was longer than a minute.
Session 2, and there was no discussion of that this morning. So I would like, if anybody would like to respond to any of the presentations that were made. The presenters had no opportunity to do that.
Can I say something very quickly?
About what I've just said.
What about the question of identity, which was the subject of the presentation? It's linked, though, isn't it?
Yes, but I think some of the presenters might like an opportunity to get a feedback.
Chair, I wanted to come in strongly on this because there's a lot of philosophizing going on here, and the views expressed, I forgot your name, very, very important views, and of that generation. And I believe, I want to hear from Christos, what is your advice to the politicians now, in the talks that are going on in Cyprus? What we're interested here is to see a solution and a unified island. What is your advice to them how to take the views you expressed?
I'm not sure.
Have they taken in any of this? Have you presented any of these views to them?
Well, we try to work with geometry to think about these problems. As architects, we don't have the sphere of, let's say, of application and work that a politician has. But I would like to believe that there is ways to coexist. I think there is many multicultural societies in the world. I think what is at stake in the world today is to find a system where we can all exist in peace and prosperity. That's what every human being wants, everywhere in the world, no matter what culture they are from. Nobody wants to live in war, and nobody wants to be poor and look for food every day. And I think our responsibility to the world, and maybe to even our children, is to deliver them something where they can fulfill their dreams and their desires, where they can learn, where they can apply their knowledge and give it back to the world and to each other.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to pick up this theme. The title of the conference is Cyprus Achievements and Challenges. It ought to be put on record that one of the great achievements of the Republic of Cyprus has been to transform itself gradually over the decades, and in spite of the invasion and occupation, into a generally open, liberal democracy. which is committed to the rule of law, and which cherishes human rights. Look at Gaza. Cyprus could have turned into another Gaza after 1974. It didn't. It's now a member of the European Union, which is an organisation which we can easily criticise, but it's an organisation that emerged from the rubble of the Second World War and was dedicated to those cherished principles: the rule of law, democracy, equality, and human rights. And those are concepts that are built into the EU treaty. Now, if we go back to the 1960 Constitution, as I see it, from the standpoint of 2010, it was institutionally racist. It provided for a Greek Cypriot president and a Turkish Cypriot vice president. And as for the Armenians, Maronites and Latins, well, they would have to be accommodated with some special status. I was born and brought up in England. I can stand for Parliament, I can become Prime Minister, I can become a High Court judge. My ethnic or religious background should have nothing whatsoever to do with my ability to progress in society. Our Lord Chief Justice, our head of the judiciary here in England and Wales, Lord Judge, was born in Malta during an air raid in the Second World War. Our Master of the Rolls, our second most senior judge, is of Jewish background. The fact that they have those roots has played no part in their ability to reach the top of society. And this is my great disagreement with this bicommunal, bizonal concept. It envisages the perpetuation and the institutionalisation of racism. Cyprus today, as the gentleman has just commented, is not the Cyprus of 1960. We have citizens of the Republic who are of Russian origin, who are of British origin, who are of Indian origin, who are refugees from Africa and have subsequently acquired the citizenship of the Republic. Why shouldn't somebody of Indian origin have the ability to become President of the Republic? Why should they have to be Greek or Turkish? Why should the Armenians have the opportunity? And I'll just conclude on this point. As I see it, the political leaders in Cyprus, whatever their ethnic or religious background, resemble figures who have found themselves bogged down in quicksand. And they're sinking into the quicksand, and they will continue to sink into the quicksand until eventually they're drowned. This is a suffocating process that we're seeing unfolding in Cyprus. And this conference may be an opportunity for a fresh approach to be adopted. And what should the fresh approach be? It should be rooted in those cherished concepts which are built into the EC Treaty. And I'm going to restate them. They are the rule of law, democracy, human rights, and equality. And this is where the UK comes into the picture. The rule of law is a concept that traces its origins back to classical Athens, in the works of Aristotle in particular. But in the modern era, it's been the United Kingdom that has developed the principle of the rule of law. It's the United Kingdom that has, notwithstanding Iraq and Afghanistan and all the other nonsense that George W. Bush brought us into, it's the United Kingdom that has advanced the concept of human rights. And Lord Bingham, who's recently stepped down as senior law lord, has articulated beautifully in a magnificent book the principles embodied within this concept of the rule of law. And if we are to have a settlement in Cyprus, I would take the best writings of Aristotle and the writing of Lord Bingham and ensure that they are built into the settlement.
Thank you. We've got 15 minutes. We've got 15 minutes.
To learn from other people, and we're learning from everywhere around the world, and the world is not a static institution, it's constantly developing. Now, there is nothing wrong in exchanging ideas, in exchanging, learning about different kinds of foods. We're eating every kind of food today. Everywhere in the world they're eating kebabs, we're eating hummus, they're eating hummus now. Now, that's a culture. Now, as Cypriots, we do have a common culture. It doesn't matter whether we speak Greek or whether we speak Turkish. What is bad for us is the nationhood or nationalism and the occupational ideologies of being imposed, and this is what people are resenting, the occupational ideologies of being Turkish means you don't identify with culture in terms of what you eat, how you dress, how your mannerism is, what your values are, but with a flag. Whether it's a blue and a white striped flag, is that what identifies being a Greek Cypriot? Is it a crescent and a star that identifies a Turkish Cypriot? Now, in fact, the very people who are imposing these cultures, these nationalism onto us, these occupational ideologies on us, are the very people who are destroying our culture in Cyprus. In North Cyprus now, they're the best in prostitution, casinos. That was not our culture. They're importing. I mean, they're developing a tourism which is not based on people coming onto our island and enjoying historical things and good things. We're asking people to come and enjoy gambling. We have Playboy clubs, nightclubs, and this is what we Cypriots object to. As Turkish Cypriots, they're very conscious of that, and they're actually afraid of losing the identity that they do have. But they are afraid of the settlers who are coming in, and some of the things that they're bringing in terms of which do not identify with the Turkish Cypriot, and they do identify that as an occupational. Things are changing in the image of Turkey. Now, as I said, culture is a good thing, but not picking up a particular way that an occupation force is forcing onto us, or flags and jingoism. It's a way of life that we must develop. And if we look between Turkish Cypriots and Greeks, we'll find a lot of common ground in what we eat, the way we think, the values between ourselves and our children, and everything else. And that's what we must focus on, the similarities, not the differences.
Can I just say something about the question of identity, because it ties in with what you've just said, what this lady's just said, and what Christos has said, which I did agree with, although I'm sorry, I do still have terrible problems with your design and how your wonderful ideas translates into concrete, but never mind, that's just my personal hang-up. And it also ties in with what Mary said this morning, and I wanted to have the opportunity to talk about that, because as a broadcast journalist who has to write very short reports of about 50 seconds explaining the Cyprus problem to people not necessarily in England, but in other parts of the world, Africa, where they can barely identify Cyprus on the map, for example. A lot of the issues that Mary was talking about this morning are extremely pertinent to me. What language do you use if you're trying in the space of 50 seconds to explain an extremely complicated situation where words mean different things to different communities? So I end up with particular phrases that I trot out. If, for example, you have to identify what Mr. Talat or what Mr. Erolu is, it's the president of the self-declared Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus. So you have ascertained he's the president, quote unquote, but that the republic that he's president of is not recognised. The invasion prompted by a Greek-backed military coup. I spend ages worrying about these phrases, and to be honest, it gets terribly sterile and terribly reductive. What I wanted to say in connection with this is where what Mary said ties in with the broader question of identity. One of the few things that has given me cause for hope about Cyprus in the last couple of years was a survey that was organised by Nikos Ioannides at Intercollege. Sorry, we're not allowed to call it. Sorry, it's not
Nicosia University.
Sorry, yes, Nicosia University, yes. And Muharrem Fires in the north. And it was a survey of many hundreds of youngsters between the ages of 17 and 25. And they were asked about their attitudes about all aspects of life, about the Cyprus problem, about their relations with their parents, about their job prospects, about sex, about everything. And they were also, amongst all those questions, asked how they saw themselves. Were they Turkish Cypriots, were they Greek Cypriots, or were they Cypriots? And astonishingly, they said they were none of those things. They were Mediterranean. And I just thought that was so exciting, that there was a whole generation that was just forgetting about these labels. And they saw themselves as Mediterranean. And this is a whole new kind of bag in which you can put anything you want to, really. And that's a new generation of people who are defining themselves in completely new and so far apolitical terms. And that just seemed to me quite liberating. I mean, yes, it's kind of funny, it's a bit kooky and weird, but it's also enormously, in the context of Cyprus, it's really liberating. So, there we are.
Yes, you be waiting.
Just on the communal issues and linking it in with Europe, I'm not convinced that Cyprus is making the most of opportunities that Europe offers to get communities to work together. Programs such as Comenius, Youth in Action, especially EU programme body. I'm sure a lot of the money available goes aside because it's not applied for, people don't know about it, or if there are things going on, it's not projected enough to allow people to know what can happen and what Europe can do. And this is an area which Europe is very, very strong in. And I'd hope that gradually through education and dissemination of knowledge, we can persuade more sort of civil society, not just, if we just deal with education, the only thing that frightens me is that we don't want it to look top down, you must work together, actually spreading it to parents, to civil society, and to getting communities to work together in a European framework. So I just hope that somehow we can disseminate more information, particularly with the Commissioner, Vassiliou being of this area.
Yes. Thank you for mentioning my contribution. I thought that there are words that divide and there are words that bring together, and I'm happy if people want to call themselves Mediterranean, but I'm not happy if people continue the dialogue of the past, which is the mainland related to Turkey or Greece, talking about Turks and Greeks. If you have a Turkish or a Greek identity and you want to call yourself that, that's fine. But in a political sense, people are Cypriots. They are citizens of a state. And there is no citizenship training, as far as I gather, yet organised in the Education Ministry. It had to be fought for here in Britain. I was one of the people who fought for it, and I know the people who got it on, and the David Blunkett and various other people. So I think we need to tackle this, and I don't want to avoid it. This session is the one that we've latched onto Tabitha's book and her ideas, which is great, but it all relates to Britain and the colonial legacy. It's not relating to now, the people who are dealing with each other now. And we've avoided using Javian as a sounding board for some of the things that Greek Cypriots think. And he's ignored in Cyprus generally. Books are not translated from one language into the other in Cyprus. If you go to the PIO and you want to find out about the work that's been done by Nikos Ioannides about the experiences of the war in what you'd call it war in the forgotten, the forgotten in 1974. You can't get it in Turkish from the PIO because they decided it's not interesting enough, and yet it sells in Turkey itself. Now, decisions have to be made which encourage people, and leadership has to be exercised on the island. And that's what I'm saying is not happening, because we're all living in the past, using the cliches of the past, talking as if it's possible to move from where we are now to where we would like to be. Kyriakos is absolutely right. We should have the rule of law. We should have all these things. Yes, how do we get there? And I think I'm the only political person left in the room. What you do is the art of the possible in politics, and where you go to is where you can get from where you are now. And my father used to say this, you can't take people from where they aren't to where they don't want to be. You have to go along stages. And if people are going to move away from the idea that the federation is the best that's on offer, then I think that they're moving away from the idea that the island is ever going to be a united again. You need to compromise. You need to listen to people. And I would like us, more people, to be listening to what Javian is saying, because he knows the history. He's been and looked at all the archival material. He is quoted in the book The Bloody Truth. Now, The Bloody Truth is very anti-British. It's very propagandistic, and people who I asked to review it for the Friends of Cyprus said they wouldn't review it because it wasn't historical, it was just propaganda. However, some of the things that I know from Turkish Cypriots from oral history are in there, and Javian is quoted in it. And what he contributed today was that people in Cyprus have made sacrifices for Cyprus, but we don't honour them, we don't know who they are, we don't read about them in our school books. We just don't know. Mustafa Akinci, a long time ago, said we should have a statue and have build a memorial to all those people who've made sacrifice for Cyprus and done things which we want to remember. The good things, the heroes and heroines of Cyprus. We don't have anything like that. Why didn't they ask this foreign architect to build a museum like the Edinburgh Museum in Cyprus to recognise the heroes and heroines of Cyprus, instead of ruining what is a perfectly good Venetian site, which is turning away from the multicultural nature of the inner city in Nicosia. That is the reason why it's objectionable, and I agree totally with Tabitha. And I've talked to people who live in the inner city. It's left. People think they're all prostitutes down there. They think they're all foreigners. They don't go there themselves. They don't own it. And so you build a slab of concrete in front of it and you pretend you're modern. That is not what we need to do in Cyprus. Cypriots need to examine what they're saying to the outside world and to each other, and they have to stop using the cliches of the past. Otherwise they bore themselves to death, just as they really the world has moved on.
Yes.
That gives me the opportunity of asking my question I had in mind earlier on to Mary, who is of course absolutely right. My question, Mary, is how important it is just to use the proper wording. And this is not, is this method or this idea an artificial way of looking at things? Let us say the most important thing today is the new effort for the solution of the problem. Yes. Now, would that process or the possibility of success depend on the change of wording, and how do you change the wording? There are other factors, more important ones. And in some way, this is related to Clare's analysis, which is very good indeed. But this country has a history of justice of how many ages, really? That changes the way of the average man in this country. If, let us say, you have as a prime minister in 5 years' time, David, what do you call it? Miliband, it will be only a second generation man. Only a second generation man, actually. Could you imagine that in Cyprus? Menem in Argentina, who was a president only about 10 years ago, he was a second. Sorry?
The alternative to that is racism.
Well, it is, but this is the result. How did you change this situation in this country? It's the experiences of years and years. When I came in this country, and when your father came in this country, didn't think the same way as you are thinking today. That was the result of the experiences of so many years. You don't change, unfortunately, of course, you don't change the human being in terms of teaching him in once or twice. Passas was very clear how he did go through all these experiences because he happened to be the son of a family who immigrated over here. If he was in Cyprus, well, I don't know, but I don't think he would be thinking in the same terms, you see. That's the way. We must see reality first of all. Yes, we agree wholeheartedly with what you said and what Clare said, but I don't think you can change it in this way by saying, just giving a eulogy about this, how things would change if it was so. But unfortunately, it is not so. Doesn't mean, of course, nationalism is a good thing. Of course it's not. But what I'm saying is to get rid of that nationalism, you need a certain process which unfortunately, up to now, we didn't manage, and I don't think it was possible to manage. But you are right in the analysis, as Clercos is.
Yes, may I just...
Last comment.
Yes, Mr. Charalambous, Cyprus has changed. In 2004, it joined the European Union. As a consequence, the EU treaty is the binding law of the Republic of Cyprus. I accept the point that in certain circumstances and in an ideal world we'd require centuries for the mindset to change, but as a matter of law, the racist approach that underpins your analysis is not only inappropriate and unethical, it's unlawful. And some of us will be prepared, if we can rustle up the funds, to challenge any settlement in the European Court of Justice on the basis that it would be ultra-vires, unlawful under EU law. Cyprus, in my view, has to change. This 1960 mindset has to be tossed into the bin, and a fresh start is needed. The rule of law is the cardinal factor.
The last one I cannot accept what you said about the book, the bloody truth, the propaganda. Thanks to actually the absolute truth. That's it.
Well, thank you very much. We did discuss Cypriot most importantly. So I think we can follow the Russian fashion of applauding ourselves.